You're listening to Colorado Chamber Office Hours, a podcast that explores what matters most to business. I'm your host, Ed Sealover, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Colorado Chamber of Commerce and editor of the Sum and Substance. Let's get talking. Welcome to Colorado Chamber Office Hours, the podcast that brings you the news and perspective you need to know as a business owner. And today I have with me James Coleman, who is entering his 10th session as a member of the Colorado Legislature, is taking the reins as Colorado Senate President for the second session, and yet is still somehow under 40 years of age. President Coleman, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Ed. And wow, 10 years is amazing. When you said that, it hit me. I don't think I've thought about how long I've been honored to be in this position, man, but it's great to be on here with you today.
You are, I think at this point, a capital institution, but more importantly for this purposes, you are the head of the Senate, a chamber that, for those who don't know, his party dominates by a 23 to 12 seat margin, and so somebody who has a huge influence in the policy that's going to be coming out of the Capitol this year. And as such, I want to talk with you about some of the specific business issues that will come before the legislature this season. But I also want to just let you start by telling me, what are your caucus's priorities?
Well, I really appreciate that. Look, I'll start off by saying we're really focused on things we believe impact everybody universally. We want to make sure that we're focused on healthcare, making sure folks who get sick, or if you just want to go for a checkup, you can afford to go to the doctor. We want to make sure that all of our children and all of our students, whether they're K through 12, pre-K through 12, or higher ed, have access to a high quality, affordable education. We want to make sure that we can focus on affordability in terms of housing. It could be for groceries, cost of groceries, transportation. There's so many issues, but ultimately what we're saying is that we believe in a Colorado that rewards hardworking people and where everyone has a fair chance to thrive. We're going to focus most on what matters most to Coloradans. So that's bringing costs down and making life more affordable. Healthcare, housing, everyday costs like groceries, utility bills. Our caucus is going to be working on legislation that will make life a little easier for Coloradans. Also this year, we'll continue to follow through on our commitments to reach Colorado's climate goals and make utility costs more affordable, from investing in strong, diverse energy sources, including solar, wind, and geothermal, to prioritizing public transit. My grandmother is 92 years old, and she always asks me about her energy bill. These are the kinds of things that we have to make sure that people can afford as we enter the winter months and it's colder outside. They can afford to heat their homes. And then, I talked about K-12 funding a bit, but to bolster the workforce programs in higher education, we've done a lot of work to set students up for success, and we have more work to do to ensure every student has access to high quality education that will allow them to thrive throughout their lives.
We could go in a lot of different directions with all of those priorities you set forward there. I want to go back to the idea of costs and bringing costs down. And I want to talk about something you didn't necessarily mention right there, because I know this has been an issue of importance to you before, and that is the issue of regulations in terms of cost. You've talked a lot about regulatory reform. So I want to ask you, what is coming, assuming something is coming, what's going to be coming this session that can actually deal with the costs that businesses have to comply with regulations?
I've had conversations over the years, as you said, Ed, about regulation, and I've never spoken with anyone that said we don't need any regulations. It's the question of whether or not the regulations are doing what they were intended to do. Were these regulations we put in place years ago that are draconian? Are there new things we should be focused on that help business operate more efficiently? But the one key for me is that we include business in that conversation. I love being in rooms, and I'll ask people to raise their hands if they've ever run or currently run a business. And at times, there aren't very many hands that go up. It doesn't mean that we as consumers don't understand the costs of business when we want to be able to purchase something. But it's important to think about, as a business owner, how those regulations turn into impacts on my business that then turn into higher costs for consumers that may impact my ability to employ people. So what I say is this: if I don't know the answer, that's fine, but I have to go figure out the answer. And I usually find someone who knows from experience. We have to engage our business community more. So I'm hoping to work on a policy this year that will address regulations, that will look at regulations in almost an audit form, that we assess what's working, what's not working. and how do we improve in those areas to help business be more effective and run more efficiently in the state of Colorado.
And what's the end goal of that? Do you think that in the assessment there that you would see some of the unnecessary regulations go away?
Yeah, well, look, at least give us information that's informing us on what regulations we may not need. Right now, we're making decisions on new regulation or regulations that we want to take away based off of information we're hearing from businesses, but it would be great to really do a full assessment of that so that when we're making that decision about regulations, we could then say, look, this is based off of a policy that we passed. So we sat down and really deep dived into the regulatory space for business, and we've determined now that we do actually need this regulation. It's benefiting us, but this one is not. So it's less of an impulse on regulation audit, and it's more of a informed decision on what regulations we believe we do and do not need.
Now, I know that businesses who are listening to this are going to be happy to hear that. But I know that some of them are also sitting here saying, well, let's just look at some of the things that have come up in the last year or two in the legislature, including in your chamber, bills that would do things like require warning labels on gas pumps or require you to serve certain amounts of water to workers working outside at certain temperatures. How do you balance this idea of, look, we need to go back and look at regulations with the idea that there's going to be a number of bills coming forward, I'm sure, that are going to look to boost regulations as well?
Well, the policies that we run, people had to remember we're informed from somewhere. It's an idea that came up from an individual that said, man, if this warning label had been here, this wouldn't have been a negative impact or something else. So that being said, I think it's important that we just talk to one another, because a lot of times we don't have that space, that opportunity to engage one another. That's the beauty of the interim. Our caucus members have had a ton of conversations over the interim in all areas that we know we don't always have the chance to in a 120-day legislative session. Our staff has done a phenomenal job of engaging our members to ask, what policies are you running? How can we be helpful? Our staff's also done a great job of engaging state departments to make sure that we're working with state departments who ultimately implement the bills that we do pass in the law in partnership with the governor. And so for us, it's making sure that we have those conversations not in a silo. We hear from our community, we hear from someone about why we need this regulation or why we need this for business, but we don't always engage with business to have that conversation. And sometimes the first time we're talking to each other is in a committee.
One more piece of regulation I want to talk about, and I know this is an area that your majority leader has really focused on. That's artificial intelligence.
What is that?
Yes, exactly. I think if Senator Rodriguez were here, he would be able to rattle off everything he's learned in the past 3 years on this. But I'm curious, from the perspective of someone who is leading the Senate, leading your caucus, how do you want to get to a final end on this that balances consumer needs with not pushing this growing sector out of the state?
President Trump signed an executive order that would block states from enforcing laws they passed to regulate AI. It obviously would affect Colorado. Legal challenges are likely. The governor and many others have worked hard to convene a working group to find a workable path forward. And so this session, we will continue conversations about improving Colorado's existing AI legislation in order to ensure that it is effectively protecting consumers without being too burdensome on Colorado businesses utilizing AI systems. Clearly, though, this is going to be an ongoing conversation in Colorado and across the nation. What we really need, and we're happy to partner with Congress, is for Congress to work together to create a national regulatory framework that protects both consumers and innovation in the AI industry. Look, it's been a long conversation since 2024. I want to applaud Majority Leader Rodriguez on his willingness during this special session we just had earlier this year to say, let's table this, let's continue to work on this, let's extend the deadline of the implementation for AI policy to the end of this 2026 legislative session coming up so that we have the time to work on this. And so that shows me a willingness on his part, on our part, to do that work, and I'm excited about where we can come out on the end that benefits both business and consumers.
Okay, well, we'll be eager to see the details coming out of it, but it's good to understand kind of the mindset going into this. While I'm asking you to solve complex and nearly impossible problems, let me throw another one at you. A lot of last session was spent talking about the state's Labor Peace Act and the ability to unionize private companies a little bit easier. That ended up getting vetoed by Governor Polis, as many people know, but it's very likely, I'm told, that Labor's bringing a similar bill back this year. How do you see this conflict coming to some sort of resolution? I mean, what do we need to do to not have labor and business fights every year at the Capitol, in your opinion?
Well, look, I think that's a very broad question you asked at the end. I think in terms of the Labor Peace Act, it's just about finding a space where people believe they have the ability to unionize if they so choose so in the private sector. And the second election is a challenge for many folks. There were a lot of deals on the table, but just didn't move forward. And we finally got to a place where we thought we could move forward. But ultimately, although it was unanimously voted on and supported by the Democrats in both the House and the Senate, the governor vetoed the bill, and for his reasons. And what I would say is the larger, broad question that you asked is, how do we put together maybe a task force? I know we don't always like task forces, but some official framework where both businesses and labor employees can come together and say, hey, look, how do we work this out? Because I've meet very few business leaders that say, man, I hate my employees. I hope that I make a very difficult environment for them to work, and I hope that I can't pay them and provide. Like, no one says that. But at the same time, we have a couple of bad apples that in the past have mistreated their employees, and that's ultimately the power of a union to say, look, if I speak up and I say something, am I going to be fired? Is there going to be retaliation? I feel like I was mistreated, right? So I talk to a lot of great business leaders, and they say, man, I would never do that. How do we work together to find a solution that doesn't penalize me or force me to do something that I'm already doing? How do I encourage my colleagues who have businesses to look at what I'm doing to provide livable wage, affordable wage, provide benefits, provide a great work environment for my employees? I can share that model with others. And so I think to sit down with labor and business owners to have a conversation would be helpful. I don't see that happening a lot, and I would love to bring those two groups together.
Well, task forces may not be the world's sexiest solution to things, but it does mean more conversation. And I think that is certainly something that the business is, and I imagine labor is willing to have. Let me hit you on one last topic, because you started off talking about it, the idea of protecting Colorado's environment here. Mm-hmm. There has been a lot of legislation over the past 7 years since Governor Polis was inaugurated in 2019 going toward that space. At this point, what more is needed, and how do you ensure that you don't go overboard? I will just mention that the Public Utilities Commission passed a plan that would essentially get rid of gas heating of homes by 2050, and the cost that some utilities have estimated for this is in the hundreds of dollars more a month for bills. How do you approach environmental protection at this point without going overboard?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. One is we travel the state and we go to every Senate district from my office, and we sit down and we talk to utility commissions and we have conversations with them. And what they ultimately say is, man, I want to do these things. I just can't afford it. And so I think a big part of it is figuring out ways to have those conversations with them between now and then to say, how do we get you to this place? I think that's a big piece of this, Ed, is that you have people who are disagreeing, but we don't know why. It's not that they're disagreeing because they actually don't want clean energy or a clean environment. It's in part because they feel like they don't have the infrastructure, the capacity, the funding to do it. And so there's that piece. What that ends up being is what you said. It goes to the consumer and ends up costing them more money. So the cost shifts. So I think our goal is to figure out, as we travel the state, how to engage the different communities that provide energy and say, what is it that you need from us as a state to actually meet these goals? And we believe that it's possible. Others have said that they can do it, but others said that they can't, right? So again, it's about sharing those best practices. And we all ultimately want two things. We want both clean, but we also want affordable energy. So we got to figure out a way to do that.
This has been a conversation about conversations, and I think that tells us a lot about President Coleman here, someone who's willing to try to bring together both sides and have these conversations. President Coleman, I imagine you're got a lot more talking to do over the next 120 days here. Good luck with everything that's coming, and thank you for joining us on Colorado Chamber Office Hours.
Thank you so much, Ed, and thank you for being the greatest leader of all time.
That's it for our interview segment. Now let's take a quick look at what you need to know about the week ahead. Thanks again, everyone, for tuning into episode 1 of Colorado Chamber Office Hours. The podcast seeks to spur discussions of the biggest issues in business, particularly the intersection of business and policy. Now, we'll be featuring interviews like the one you just heard with some of the biggest movers in this space. And we'll also be giving you a heads up on the most significant business events, from legislative committees to rulemaking hearings to key report releases, that are coming in the week ahead. That said, this week is one of the slowest weeks of the year for such events, as the legislature doesn't convene until next week. And so rather than talk to you about the week ahead, I want to talk to you about the 120 days ahead. Specifically, the 2026 regular Colorado legislative session, which is scheduled to run from January 14th to May 13th. And I want to give you a little bit of an overview of how this will play out, both to prepare you for what is sure to be a news-filled 4-month period, but also to tell you how you can get involved and ensure that your voice is heard by your elected representatives. So first, the big picture schedule. The 2026 session, as I mentioned, will convene on Wednesday, January 14th at the state capitol in Denver. The first few days will be ceremonial, but we'll also give some good ideas on what the big issues of the session will be. On opening day, for example, the leaders of both the majority and minority caucuses in both the House and Senate will give opening day remarks that typically lay out their visions for the session. Remember that Democrats hold a near veto-proof majority in each chamber. That's 43-22 advantage in seats in the House and a 23-12 advantage in seats in the Senate. So the agendas laid out by Senate President James Coleman and House Speaker Julie McCluskey will be particularly important to hear. Then on the next day, Thursday the 15th, term-limited Democratic Governor Jared Polis will give his 8th and final State of the State address, in which he will detail his priorities for this session. The comparisons between the 5 speeches, which I will offer on the Sum and Substance at tsscolorado.com, should illustrate both potential areas of compromise and the flashpoints that will mark the coming months. After that, the next week to week and a half likely will be fairly slow, as most legislative committees start the session by holding what are called SMART Act hearings, in which leaders of the various state departments offer reports on how they are implementing laws passed during previous sessions. But by the week of January 26th, those same committees will start holding bill hearings at which lobbyists and members of the public will have the chance to testify on issues. So how do these committees work? Most of them are going to meet twice a week between Monday and Thursday, with a few committees that are going to meet on Friday. They tend to meet either right after the House and Senate finish their floor work. That's pretty early in the session, say 9:30 or 10 a.m., a little bit later as floor work gets going later in the session. And then they also meet right after lunch, with most afternoon hearings starting at 1:30 or 2 p.m. Now, the agenda can be packed with multiple bills, so if there's one that you're interested in and it's not first on the agenda, its timing will depend on what comes before it. That could mean for some bills that a 1:30 committee may not take up your bill until mid to late afternoon or even the evening hours as the session winds along. Reminder, to pass a bill into law, a bill must clear its assigned committee, or sometimes committees, in the chamber where it starts. Then go to the floor for 2 days of debate and achieve a majority there. If that happens, the whole process repeats in the second chamber, and finally Governor Polis then will sign or veto the bills. Legislators can override a veto by repassing the bill by a 2/3 margin in each chamber, but I got to tell you, I've been covering the legislature since 2007. I have never seen that happen. So how do you get your voice heard? Because these committees are fairly important to the bills, obviously. All committees take public comments. Typically, those are limited to 2 or 3 minutes per person, but they can go on for hours, not individually, but the number of comments. You can show up and testify in the committee room, or you can sign up to offer online comments. Now, to do that, you have to sign up under the particular bill you want to comment on at the legislative website, which is leg.colorado.gov, and your voice will be heard. Some people ask me, do the comments make a difference? In most cases, I would say yes. There typically are a number of legislators going into a hearing that have decided already how they're going to vote, but there also usually are a couple of undecided legislators per committee. The comments can have an impact on them. Not only that, but they'll be printed in publications like mine and other media outlets, and those tend to grow legs as the session goes along. So if you have something you feel will influence a legislator and will be heard, I'd recommend do it. Now, a couple session high points I'll go over real quickly with you. Late January, as I mentioned, the bill hearings will start in earnest. By late March, the legislature has to pass the $47.9 billion state budget. This means much of the second half of that month will be taken up with debates over how to spend things rather than particular bills. By early May, you've got to scramble on. You got to get all the bills out by May 13th, and that's going to lead to some long days and nights at the Capitol. And finally, June 12th is Governor Polis's deadline to sign and veto bills. So I hope that helps you out a little bit. That's a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be watching this session. Remember to follow the Sum and Substance at tsscolorado.com all session long to be kept abreast of what's happening. And of course, listen to Colorado Chamber office hours every Monday morning, both for interviews with top legislators and business leaders and for a detailed description, at least starting next week, of what's going to be coming that week. Thanks for being a part of this process. That's all for this episode of Colorado Chamber Office Hours. Once again, I'm Ed Seelover, Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Colorado Chamber of Commerce and editor of the Sum and Substance. I'll keep the conversation going at tsscolorado.com, and we'll see you next time as we explore the issues that matter most to business.